Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, this is going to be the next episode in the Road to 1.0, the series where I take a fresh new character from level 1 all the way to my first empowered shade so I can collect a bunch of data about season starters so I can give good recommendations when 1.0 comes around, whenever that does come around. So this is going to be about Blood Spectres. Blood Spectres are a new addition to my Necromancer toolbox ever since I first tried them back right before the multiplayer patch went live. And then, of course, they were bugged out with Sacrifice, so you couldn't play them until they're bug fixed. I did actually check to try to find information about these minions before I made a video about it, but it seems like as though the video that I made right before multiplayer launching is the first mention I've ever seen of just Blood Spectres. So that's interesting. Uh, Essentially, the idea is we use sacrifice, right, to sacrifice our minions. And whenever we do that, we summon a bunch of wraiths that, of course, do melee damage and attack enemies. These wraiths have really favorable base stats, and they have a really good tree in sacrifice, which means you can make them do a very large amount of damage on the cheap. And you can start playing this as soon as like level 40, I think, or something like that. I'll have to check the planner, but like you can start playing this very early, as what you require isn't that high. You just need a few skills specialized and you're good to go, right? And all of that combined makes this into a very favorable league starter, especially thanks to all the buffs to minion AI, at least specifically for wraiths. So if you don't know, minion AI had been buffed significantly in recent patches. So whenever a wraith or some other minion, specifically wraiths, those are the ones I can remember off the top of my head, whenever they go and attack an enemy, they will stick on that enemy until it dies and then move towards you after that. Before, what would happen is the minion would attack a random enemy, and if you move too far away, the minions would stop attacking that random enemy and come towards you. This is very disfavorable. Like, it was very bad. Like, let's be real. It was very bad, and it sucked. And it made the old clear on Blood Spectres just kind of mediocre. But now with the new AI, where they just stick on a target until they die and then they come back to you, it's significantly better. Like, I'm talking like oodles and boodles better. Like, it's insane how much better the clear is with just a small little tweak to, of course, their AI, right? And of course, recently as well, they got a different animation, so they look much better now. They look very sick. And overall, I think this is definitely one of the more competitive Necromancer builds to exist, especially on 0 to no gear. So if you want to play a build where you have a bunch of different melee minions doing damage, then this is definitely the build for you. The build is built around dealing as much ailment damage as possible, and that's between bleed and poison damage. Sadly, Necromancer doesn't have the tools to focus this ailment damage into one type so we can benefit from better items. So we have to kind of split our damage between poison and bleed, but it's okay because there's enough support for both of them to give us enough damage to deal with things, right? Now, another thing you must be noticing if you're watching the clips, right, on my video here, my HP is very low. Well, that is mainly because I've noticed over the past few builds that I've tried for this series, for league starting and stuff, right, for testing purposes, hybrid setups are actually really good. Essentially, what you do is you try to get to a modicum amount of HP, like 1500, let's say, right? And then you try to get as many different sources of ward generation as possible through the passive tree, through skill trees and stuff like that. And that essentially allows you to have a pseudo HP pool for early on, because early on, when you're in powered monoliths and like the earlier monoliths, you don't need too much EHP to survive. Like, it's pretty easy to deal with most of that. So just having that little benefit that the ward is giving us on top of our HP is enough to keep us alive, which is kind of amazing, to be honest. I never thought that like hybrid would actually be good, but it turns out on a low budget standpoint, hybrid is pretty good. So most of our ward is coming from our sacrifice loop. So whenever we kill our skeletons, Each skeleton on death gives us 40 ward, and then we get 35 ward on minion death. So that's even if our specters die as well, which they die all the time. And of course, we have that really overpowered node that gives us like a percentage chance to gain like 130 flat ward whenever a nearby enemy or ally dies. So all of that combined means that not only do we have a decent amount of HP at this point, we also get a very large amount of ward for free. And of course, we're using defensive layers like Aura of Decay, giving us that heal on our life bar. We have like a little bit of HP regen, and all of that combined means that we actually can take some hits, unironically, which is kind of funny considering, we're a squishy necromancer. We're not supposed to be taking these kind of hits this early, but turns out with some tech, we can end up being much tankier than your average build, which is fun for this level of investment, by the way. Yeah, this build's been great. Now, I actually did revamp the way that I'm going to be talking about leveling. I did manage to snapshot my character a few times throughout leveling with the last Epoch planner, which means that we can go into a much more detailed stance of talking about leveling, which we're going to go in right now. All right, here we are in planner. We can talk about how I leveled this build. We have 3 different planners. We have the 1 to level 38 planner, the right after 38 when we swap into Blood Spectres planner, and then we have the finish planner of what I ended up with when I got to my first empowered shade. So let's talk about how I started the character. So mainly, we're going to be utilizing something like Wandering Spirits, right? Into, of course, Hungering Souls. Then we're going to use our last 2 slots to level up our Sacrifice and level up our Summon Skeleton. This is the snapshot of my character the moment before I swapped into Blood Spectres. And then what I did was I respect everything, swapped into Blood Spectres, and then, of course, I moved on with this setup, right? And then, of course, this is, like I said, the end game setup of what I had at the end of the character's lifetime. So let's talk about how I leveled. So I utilized Wandering Spirits in my first specialization slot. I took 2 points travel into Soul of Rage first, 1 point into Poison Mind, and then 1 point into Spectral Putrescence. Early on, this poison damage that you're dealing is a lot of extra free damage for your Wandering Spirits and gives you a lot more clear than you normally would have. Although the Wandering Spirits, you're mainly focusing on the spell damage over time portion of it, as it just gives you a lot of free clear when you're clearing through the monoliths and stuff, and also gives you single target. Then after that, what I did was I focused on getting the cooldown from Spirit Swarm so I could spam the button much more after that. And then I took 2 points travel into Lingering Souls, and then I took 4 points into Tethered Existence for a little bit more damage, right? I'm not entirely sure if this is the correct way to go about it when you're leveling, but I think this is fine if you're just going to swap into a different build later anyways. For the second skill that I specialized into, we specialized into Hungering Souls. We take 5 points into Inspired Hunger for the 40% more damage over time while possessed. This is a gigantic buff to our Wandering Spirits, and both of these combined means that we deal significant amounts of single target damage while also having clear for most of the early game. Then, of course, for Sacrifice, this is the exact sacrifice tree I would heavily suggest having before swapping into it. You need this many points into Sacrifice before you can swap into it, which is like 12 points if I'm not mistaken, because we need the chain, so we summon multiple Blood Spectres at once. We need the Blood Spectre node as well, of course. We need 1 point into Hemophage so that we get the leech for the Blood Spectres so that they leech from their ailment damage so they don't die instantly as they're attacking things. Then we need Crimson Horror so we have a 100% chance of always summoning a Blood Spectre. Then, of course, we need 1 point into Blood Weaver and some bleed chance on the tree, the passive tree here, which I'll show you in a moment. Yep, some bleed chance on the passive tree, eventually, which I'll swap into as I'll show you. That is about when you can swap into, of course, Blood Spectres, as I'll show you in a moment here. Then, of course, Summon Skeleton, we mainly need, of course, Empty the Grave set up beforehand, and then we need Mind Catcher, and then the rest is like whatever. Eventually, you do want to grab the extra skeleton as well. And that's essentially what my character looked like before I respect. You can come in here, look at the passives, go through the passives, right, and figure out what you're going to do. Of course, you want to focus on Necromancer first to get access to Sacrifice so that you can specialize it, so you can start getting that XP early on to get to level 12 so that you can swap into the next build, which we are doing right now. Here you go. This is what I swapped into. Main thing I did was I went to the Gambler and got a sickle with minion damage percentage on it, and then you want to be looking out for minion damage over time percent affixes. This gives you a lot of free damage early on. You can get a sickle at this point from the Gambler, which is really good, right? It's a really good base for our current setup, which is great. And of course, I'll show you what I specialized into. So of course, we specialized into Sacrifice, we specialized into Summon Skeleton, and then we also specialized into Transplant here. Mainly on Transplant, we just simply need Transfusion, and then we're good to go. And then for Summon Volatile Zombie, right? Uh, Mainly, I've been using it for Sustain, but I believe that this is a mistake. I don't think you go summon Volatile Zombie, to be honest with you. I think what you do instead is you go with Aura of Decay and grab all the extra damage, because it seemed like as though as soon as I grabbed Aura of Decay, my damage skyrocketed. So you definitely, instead of going zombies, you want to go with Aura of Decay like this. So we're going to respec this real quick, and I'll leave this in the description as well. You just want to mainly grab all these nodes, right? And then grab all the poison res like that. This is like where you want your Aura of Decay to be. And that's probably going to be much better than the zombies that I was trying to mess with, right? And of course, the passive tree, I completely revamped it after this point, and you can go into the planner and figure out how I revamped it. And then eventually, we can look at the last planner here, which is what my character ended up being. We didn't make too many changes from this planner. We just simply refined it a little bit more, which means that we can go in game and talk about this build further. All right, now here we are in game with the character, so we can do the full build showcase. So before we get into the skills and stuff, I want to show you guys the skill rotation so you understand how to properly play this build, because yes, it does require some idea of what you're doing, right? So for the main combo, right, as soon as you get this set up, what you're going to be doing is going to be casting your summon skeletons, whether once or twice, depending on how many sacrifice chains you have, right? Early on, when you swap, you're going to only have 2 extra sacrifice chains, so you only want to cast it once and then cast Transplant. But then later on, when you get all 3 sacrifice targets here, that means you can actually cast Summon Skeleton twice and then Transplant, right? So now we're going to Transplant. That's going to suck up a little bit of mana, and then it's actually going to give us all of our minions. So now we have a bunch of free minions. These Blood Spectres. Now, these Blood Spectres, they do a bunch of damage, they leech their health back, and it's great, right? And then, of course, as soon as I do that, what I usually do is I place a new Dread Shade on them. My current Dread Shade setup is set up so that it's autonomous, meaning that as long as I place it on one of my minions, they can go out and kill stuff for me without me having to interact with them. I don't have to sit in the circle. They can just do whatever they need to, and I just do that. I do that every single time I summon a new batch, and they go and kill stuff for me. And of course, whenever I need a little bit extra single target damage, what I do is I make sure to sit on top of my minions, because when I'm sitting on top of my minions, we are applying, of course, Plague Bearers, so they get the poison chance and they get more damage for poison, which is great, which allows the poison damage from our minions to compete with the bleed damage that we're currently doing as well. So that's pretty much how you play this build in Monoliths. You just, kind of like just summon your stuff, keep moving on, summon your stuff, keep moving on, right? And make sure that you kind of stay away from your pack, because you don't want to transplant already summoned Blood Spectres, because you'll accidentally sacrifice them, because sacrifice doesn't care what monsters you're actually sacrificing. I can tell there I lost a bunch of mana, and that's because we're not sacrificing Summoned Skeletons, because Summoned Skeletons is actually giving us mana back, which is helping us sustain our Blood Spectres, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it for the skill rotation. Let's talk about the skill itself. So for Sacrifice, we take 1 point travel into Temple of Awe, 1 point travel into Necrotic Audience, 1 point into Catalyst of Horror. This makes it so that we chain to multiple targets with Sacrifice, so that we sacrifice multiple targets for Blood Spectres. Then 3 points into Sanguine Libation, so we sacrifice 6 minions at once, which is great. Then 2 points into Pontifex Travel, 1 point into Blood Spectre, 2 points into Hemophage, so we get a little bit of leech for our minions so that they can sustain themselves. Eventually, when you get plus levels 2 Sacrifice, one day when you have better gear than me, you want the last point in this, so we get the 75% health leech for our minions, as you want minions to be leeching from their dot damage specifically, because this is generic damage leech, which applies to, of course, ailments as well. This allows our blood specters to last much longer, because normally blood specters, they will continue to degen once you summon them. So you want to have as much leech as possible so that they stay alive as long as possible. As you can tell, they start degenning, so you definitely want them to be leeching. So you want the last node in here. Then 5 points into Blood Weaver. This gives us a massive amount of melee bleed chance while also reducing the cost of our blood specters. This is definitely the first few points that you want to be grabbing once you get the setup set up, so that you can actually, sustain the mana cost for your build. Then 3 points into From Blood, so you get a bunch of more damage and more health. Once you get like +3 sacrifice or whatever, you can definitely get extra points in here as well. Then 1 point into Crimson Horror, so that of course we always summon our blood specters, gives us more damage, more health, and always summons a blood specter so that we don't have to deal with the chance, so that, we always summon minions when we transplant. Speaking of transplant here, the main things we care about is, of course, transfusion for the sacrifice to minion, so that we use sacrifice. Whenever we use transplant to cast sacrifice, it means we don't have to spend the mana cost of sacrifice, but we still have to spend the mana cost of the blood specters. This gives us 30 free mana by just using transplant this way, and it's very efficient in terms of mana usage. And of course, we can scale cooldown recovery speed to be able to do this loop even more often, right? Another node that we care about is, of course, the haste and frenzy duration for the speed. We care about, of course, the kill threshold and the cooldown recovery speed here, right? And that's pretty much it. That's all we care about for transplant. Now for Aura of Decay, the main nodes we care about is, of course, the Plague Bearer stuff, the infectious bones for the more damage with poison stuff. Remember, you have to stand next to your allies, which means you do need Plague Rat for the area, so that the area is decently big so you can catch all your minions in it, right? Then, of course, 4 points to Absence of Life early on. This is a savior. Like, it helps you so much with sustaining early on. This, combined with the health regen and all the ward, makes you feel very tanky, which is ironic as a necromancer, right? And of course, 4 points into Respite as well, so that we get a bunch of free poison resistance. And of course, Aura of Decay not only makes us take 50% less poison damage while active, we get this 20% less poison damage as well from this. And of course, the poison resistance here. All of this combined means that we essentially don't care about poison at all, which is great, which like phenomenal, to be honest. So cool. Eventually later on, if you feel spicy and you feel like as though you have enough poison resistance and stuff like that, you can grab Fume Weaver, which makes it so enemies, they take increased poison damage from us, like from our allies, because we're reducing their poison resistance, right? And that's pretty much it for Aura of Decay. Summon skeletons, we have a few points that are necessary. You want to make it so that you have no warriors. The main reason why is because, let's imagine your blood specters are over here, right? And they're attacking the boss. When I summon my skeletons, I don't want my skeletons to be melee and move over here and attack the enemy. I want them to stay here so I can like keep them away from my blood specters, so I can cast sacrifice on my skeletons and not my blood specters. So we want our, of course, our minions to be ranged so that they stay still. We do need 1 extra skeleton for this build, so we can get to 6 skeletons with the +2 from the passive tree and stuff. So that's important. The mana efficiency is important here as well. The mana gained on death. This is actually giving us enough mana whenever we summon enough skeletons to sustain our blood specter loop. So whenever you watch my mana here, you can see like it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. That is thanks to this node in combination with everything else. And of course, we grab Empty the Grave so that, of course, we get extra skeletons on cast, which is efficient for us. Then Dreadshade, it's your stereotypical poison Dreadshade setup. There's nothing too specific. Just copy this, put it on a minion, get a lot of free damage. Not too complicated. Now, for passives, the more important passives, there's passives like this that give you free bleed duration, which is great. You want as much minion attack and cast speed as humanly possible. This node is insane for ward generation when we're constantly cycling through enemies and minions, right? Which is great. Then of course we want to eventually grab the rest of these points so we can get even more minion bleed chance, right? These points are really good. Then for Necromancer here, main nodes we want is stuff like this: Reclamation of Souls for the ward on minion death. This on top of all the ward on death with all of our other stuff means whenever I do a loop like this, I gain a bunch of ward for free, which gives us a lot of buffer for damage early on, which is great. Grab the extra skeleton here, grab all the attack and cast speed, grab all the free melee poison chance, right? Because we're a melee minion build. And then we're eventually grabbing Veins of Malice for the haste and frenzy. And then eventually, when you get enough points, you want to be grabbing Empty the Graves so you get a bunch of free armor and health regen percentage from having a bunch of minions, because you're going to be having a bunch of minions with this build. So this is definitely what you want. If you want a finished version of Blood Spectre Necromancer, I will be linking a version down below that you can look at and adapt from that video from this build, right? Now, let's talk about gearing. For gearing, it's very simplistic. All you really care about is bleed chance on your helmet and as much intelligence as possible, because intelligence not only scales your minion's life. So if we go and check sacrifice here, we get a bunch of free intelligence to minion life scaling, right? Which is great because it keeps them alive. We get the bleed chance, the bleed duration eventually, the bleed penetration as well, stuff like that. Because we're focusing mainly on bleed, we just have a little bit of extra minion poison chance for free, right? And of course, minion physical damage on a skeletal scepter is going to be your best in slot early on. This is going to be great for a lot of percentage damage, as we want as much as possible. Amulet here, it's like we need a little bit of mana regen. So right now I'm at 16 mana regen. This seems to be enough mana regen to maintain our loop currently, but as you get the cooldown of transplant down and you start doing the loop more often to summon more blood specters, right, with cooldown recovery speed on transplant, you're going to need more mana regen. So pay attention to that. Get some exalted mana regen rolls. It's like some minion health regen rolls help as well. It makes it so that whenever you summon your blood specters, they don't instantly start dying. They have a few seconds before they start dying, so they have some time to go and start actually attacking enemies. So having a little bit of minion health regen is great. It's like for rings, it's like very shitty. Like you can look at the planner down below to look at how shitty my gear is if you want. Like intelligence, minion health, mainly for gear slots, like intelligence, minion health, and mana regen are your focuses, because the intelligence gives the flat minion health, gives us the percent damage, gives us the ward retention, so our ward is pretty good, right? And of course, the minion health makes it so our blood specters last longer, and since we have no cap of blood specters, the more they last, the more blood specters we get, and of course the minion damage eventually too, right? And that's pretty much it for the gear. For idols, I just went with chance to gain ward when hit. You could also go for essentially just cooldown recovery speed while transplant, or some HP idols or res idols. Like it doesn't really matter. And that's pretty much it for the build. Like I said, if you want to check the full version or a different build that you can transition this build into, check the description. With all that being said, this has been Dread, off to go do something else. Bye.